For many voice actors, audiobooks is the place they start. Countless hours spent prepping, reading, recording, editing, and delivering the stories that so many of us listen to on a daily basis. Now, to help give us a little more insight into the audiobook genre, I'm welcoming a guest with 23 years of experience, 5 Audie Award nominations, and this next one, particularly impressive, 1,000 plus audiobooks narrated and counting. Welcome to the show, Sean Pratt.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I feel like to do 1,000 audiobooks, you've been in the booth recording since birth, basically.
Well, it's funny. I realize that I've actually I'm going to be coming up on my 26th year. I guess I gave you an old bio there. But yeah, I started in 27 almost. I started in 96.
Wow.
And initially, I was a theater actor. That's what I started acting when I was 10, started working professionally when I was 20. And I got into audiobooks around the time I was 30. I was been a repertory theater actor for a long time.
Okay.
And it's a lot of fun, but it'll wear you out, that kind of
Yeah.
schedule. And, but yeah, there was a big chunk of especially when the kids were little, I was doing a book a week. I did 50 books a year over year over year.
That is
And
incredible.
yeah, it was pretty crazy. Now I do half that many because I coach obviously now. So
This is going to be a really stupid question, I'm sure, but the audiobook genre, I feel like I didn't even realize that it had been around that long. I mean, I guess I think about Amazon came and there's ACX and there's Audible and I became more familiar with it. Obviously, the internet, mid-90s. I mean, there was barely an internet usable. But were they on CD before that?
yeah. So originally, if you really want to go back, audiobooks, at least in this country, started with the Library of Congress doing archival recordings of things. This goes
Okay.
all the way back to the Great Depression in the 30s.
Okay.
And they did things like they would record musicians, like Appalachian musicians or whatever, and then say, well, let me do spoken word stuff. And so it goes way, way back. But as far as what we consider an audiobook, you could sort of point to the 80s around that time, I'm guessing, because of
Okay.
cassette tapes.
Yeah.
And initially, audiobooks, by and large, they fell into a couple different. Some of them were for Library of Congress for archives. They never were released.
Right.
Then you had a batch that were more promotional things, like they would do like a gimmick. It was a promo gimmick. So
Okay.
let's say the new Stephen King book comes out, The Stand, that says, hour. They would do like a little 60-minute or 90-minute clip or, excerpts from it. They'd hire some Hollywood actor to do that. But really, books on tape and recorded books started the real floodgates of this. And what they would do is they would have them recorded in studio in LA or New York or Chicago, or whatever, and they came out on cassette tapes. And you'd go to the library and you had this massive box, and you pop it open and there was all the cassettes.
Right.
And of course, we were recording, on ADAT machines at the time, which was VHS tape. And then you dub them down to your masters. Some people recorded on DAT, which is a smaller format, but the videotapes were a higher quality for its time. And so, yeah, it started out as cassettes. You would get them in a library. And then eventually recorded books had a thing where you could subscribe, like, this really dates me, like the Columbia Record Club kind of stuff.
Right. Oh,
right?
yes.
And so that plastic box would come with this little tape thingy on it. You'd listen to it when you're done, you'd do it and you'd drop it back off into, in a post office box, and they would mail it back. And that's how the early, if you think about like Blockbuster Video or early Netflix,
Right.
it was all done by mail. And then when I came on board, we were still doing cassettes in 96, and then soon after CDs came on. And so now the size of the packaging shrank, but it was still CDs because there was no internet. I mean, the internet was starting to come on board, but
very infant. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the size of the downloads was prohibitive. Eventually, it got better and better.
Can you imagine downloading an 8-hour audiobook on your 28.8 modem and on your Commodore 64? Yeah.
Yeah, you listen to them on cassette or CD. That's how you did it.
Yep.
And so then I don't it was around 2000 that we went digital, and at least I did anyway. And I used Pro Tools
Yep.
to start, and then and we would burn CDs off of those. But sometime it was around the time that, well, Audible and came around, and then it was purchased by Amazon. But that Audible was the thing that broke through. The download speeds got faster. People's had smartphones that you could download to, or your
Hmm.
computer, and then it was those things all came together in the early 2000s, and then the audiobook industry just exploded. It grows on a geometric curve.
Well, I was going to say with high speed internet, Audible, Amazon, right? Like that's really where
Yeah,
it hits scale because it's so much more
yeah,
accessible to everybody at that point.
right. And now
So
I load it on my phone when I go for when
yeah,
I'm traveling or go for a run or whatever.
so I'm curious with 1,000 plus in your portfolio, um, first book, most
Hmm.
challenging book, and maybe your all-time favorite that you've been able to narrate.
Okay, first book was Cabbages and Kings by O. Henry. It was a piece of fiction, a bunch of short stories.
Okay.
I got that from Blackstone Audio. They were my very first clients way
Okay.
back when. Uh, Most challenging book. In the fiction category, my most challenging book was Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. By far the most challenging fiction piece. It was, 57 hours long.
Oh
Um,
man.
and then my most challenging nonfiction piece for me as a performer, I did a 2-volume biography of Abraham Lincoln by Michael Burlingame, and that clocked in at 110 hours. It took a year
Oh
to
wow.
record. I and it came. This is back when they would send you the physical book. So like when I did Infinite Jest, they literally printed it out, and this huge box came of 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper,
Jeez.
which was good because I had to, I marked up my script like you do
Yep.
with regular VO, and then the Abraham Lincoln piece came as these. They looked like little like Britannicas, like
Yep.
phone books. They were huge, and so the text was tiny. So it was a lot of work to prep it, and see, most challenging. And then what was the last one? The one I enjoyed the most, was that the question?
Yeah, the one you enjoyed the most.
All right. So in the fiction category, Infinite Jest may be the ones I've enjoyed the most. Ironically, I normally don't. People ask me, do I listen to my own stuff? And I tell them I'd rather take a beating than listen to my own voice because I talk all the time.
Yep.
But that one is one I could listen to again, and I have. And in the nonfiction category, wow, I've done so many amazing pieces. I don't have necessarily a favorite. I have new favorites, as it were.
Hmm.
I did a book about 4 or 5 years ago called "The Body Keeps the Score" by Bessel van der Kolk. He's a doctor, and it's how we internalize emotional trauma in our body and how it manifests. Like how do you deal
Okay.
with PTSD and so on.
Yep. Yep.
That was a really hard book to get through some of the stories, but very satisfying. But yeah, no, I could give you 10 great nonfiction pieces, but that one just pops to mind.
So one of the reasons that I really enjoy the e-learning genre is
Hmm.
because I feel like I'm getting paid to learn on a fairly regular basis with some of this stuff. Now, sometimes I learn stuff, it scares the crap out of me. You get into cybersecurity, e-learning and things like that. But I'm guessing there's got to be an element of that in the audiobook space too, particularly with the nonfiction, right? You
Oh yeah,
get
oh
paid
yeah.
to read these books and learn all this stuff like, the one you just mentioned.
I joke that I'm very, very good at a cocktail party because I know a little bit about everything, it seems.
Filled
Until
with
the like this,
all the
yeah.
knowledge.
Well, I'm pretty good to chat until the second or third bourbon, and then I'm who knows what. But the yeah, I mean, I've done books on religion, on history, medicine, science, contemporary culture. Do you want to know about arbitrage in international finance? I can tell you. I've done a book on it. You want to talk about, how do you actually, what is a 401k considered to a Roth IRA? I can tell you all that. I've done books on
Yep.
it. You know, what am I got in front of me? I just did a book, and then you have offbeat topics. I just did a book that's just come out called The Hidden Tools of Comedy by Steve Kaplan. And this guy, he's a teacher, coach, and writer of comedy. He's worked on lots of shows and does
Yep.
plays and theater movies. And it's like, how do you deconstruct a scene to write it? The book is pitched toward writers and directors and actors. How to not only write a funny scene, but how to fix a scene when it's not working. Fascinating book. A
Well, I was
book
going to
I
say
would.
some of that's got to translate into what you're doing in the booth by the
It
sounds of it.
does. Yeah, it
Yeah.
does. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. I've learned. I've gotten to explore topics I would never have picked up that book, but I got paid to do it, obviously, and
Mhm.
you perform it, and some of it sticks. Some of it sticks. Yes.
I will be the first to admit, audiobook narration, the idea of it scares the living snot out of me. Like I have nothing but respect, like seriously mad respect for audiobook narrators. Just not only the skill, but the stamina to get in and do some of these projects. I mean, some of the ones that you mentioned, they're behemoths. But
Yeah.
sometimes it does feel like audiobooks get a bit of a bum rap in the industry. Like they're the bastard child of the
Well, I
industry
was
or
going to
something
say
like
we're
that.
the ugly redheaded stepchild of
Yeah.
audio.
So talk about that. Why do you think that is? And how do we break that narrative?
Oh boy, that's a hard one because the problem becomes um, we well, first of all, when you look at the pay, I think it starts with pay scale.
Hmm.
So like I have friends who do cartoons and video games, in LA and New York, and they make crazy good money.
Yep.
And then you've got right behind that, you've got corporate and e-learning. And then of course you've got commercial VO, which, you can, if you land the right gig, it can be a national thing and you can make
Sure.
bank on that,
Yep.
right? And then you look at how much time does it take to do something like that?
Yep.
And it's, half an hour, couple hours
Yep.
in the studio and you're done. Or you have a series, like a guy I went to college with, Bill Salyers. I guess he was the raccoon on the Normal Show, the cartoon series. And
Okay.
so once a week, he's going in to do episodes, or he was Doc Octopus on a lot of the Spider-Man video game stuff. And you compare the return on investment or return on time, and then you go down to audiobooks. And we get paid by the finished hour,
Yep.
not the performing hour.
Yep.
And then you have the added intensity of it's a 10-hour book when it's finished,
Hmm.
and the normal just the narration part, a good audiobook narrator, the ratio is about 2 to 1.
Okay.
It takes about 2 hours of work to generate
Yep.
one finished hour that needs to be proofed, and then it comes back with your corrections and so on. So you figure, if you're just narrating it, that's 20 hours of work in the studio. That doesn't count the prep time.
Yep.
And the union scale for audiobooks is 260 per finished hour. So you compare, so in other words, that's basically $130 per working hour. So
Hmm.
when you compare that by the working hour compared to say e-learning or a
Yep.
corporate gig, it doesn't hold a candle. And so yeah, and it's just this, it's a marathon. It's a marathon, mentally, physically, vocally. And
Have
you
the
have,
rates? Oh, I was going to say, have the rates evolved as audiobooks have hit scale?
well, the problem is okay. So when you do an e-learning gig or a
Yep.
corporate gig or your commercial, the budget is already in place for the whole gig. It's
Right.
going to be paid and it's done.
Yep.
You see, right? So an audiobook is like buying a stock on Wall Street. You buy the stock and you have to let it mature over time, or a CD, whatever analogy, or
Yep.
it's going to take time to
Sure.
recoup that money. For audiobook companies, what they do is they have their A-list titles they know they're going to make money on,
Hmm.
and then they have to get a bunch of other stuff to sort of fill out their catalog, hoping some of those will hit, and they usually do, but not all of them. Like the I did that Abraham Lincoln book, gosh, at least 10, if not 15 years ago. And when the producer came to me, the company, I said, you know, my God, this is a huge project. It's going to cost you an arm and a leg. And they said, yeah, we figure it's going to be at least 5 to 7 years before we ever see a dime out of this project. But
Wow.
they've got the recording.
Yep.
You see, so it's a different business model. You see, so I said, when I do an e-learning gig, they've already got the budget for it. Here, they're making an investment, hoping that the final product over time will sell, and that changes the whole way of looking at it.
I think that's something even that I found interesting was learning that, you see books on the New York Times bestseller, and I guess you just assume that all these books are selling millions and millions and millions of copies. And
Mm,
the reality is that is not the reality. Books, even on the New York Times bestseller list, are not necessarily selling like that. And so I guess that becomes a factor in all of this too. But I guess rates definitely are. I mean, that's the one thing that comes up over and over and over again, I guess, with
So yeah, so
audiobooks.
what I say to counter that is, if you're happy to do it, just doing corporate or commercials or whatever, fine, stick with it. But I going back to my friend Bill Salyers, he spends his whole month every day 5 to 10 auditions a day easily, right?
Hmm.
And he might only work 2 or 3 times a month, but
Right.
he makes enough, and that's the paradigm of
Yep.
the kind of your world. You see, in my world, I get a book and I know I'm booked out for the next several weeks, because you only, you record maybe 1 or 2 finished hours a day, 5 days, 6 days a week. And if you do a book that's 10 hours, well, that's about 2 weeks of work. And so I like the consistency of it, right? Every day I wake up, I
Yep.
already know
Makes sense.
I'm just, like tomorrow I'm starting, I've got a series with Audiobook Empire. It's sort of a space marines, going up and fighting the bad guys in space kind of stuff. It's 15 books, and I'm on book 3 or 4, and so once a month I'll be doing that thing. So that consistency is nice,
Yep. For sure.
from my temperament. Bill likes the excitement of all the little jobs, knowing he might score one that turns into something big. For me, I like knowing that I've got 4 books in the pipeline and I'm booked out till January or
A little
whatever.
easier to budget.
Yes, the money is more consistent that way. Um, but the but what I say to, when I teach classes, I was just at when I was at VO Atlanta this year, and I'll be going to the Mid Atlantic Voiceover Conference in a few weeks. And what I say to people from a VO background is, it's not all or nothing. It's not either or. It's a yes and.
Yeah.
So, like, if you came and you were in my workshop, I would be saying, what I'll say now is, great, stay with the corporate stuff, stay with the e-learning, but you should dabble into audiobooks because it can fill in the rest of your day,
Yep.
you know, because
Yep.
there's going to be days there are no auditions. And if you know you've got a book on a long enough deadline, and maybe you only do 30 minutes of finished material a day, maybe an hour, that's 2 hours every day, and you can audition for the rest of the time. So what I'm saying is that for people who come from a VO background, commercial, corporate, whatever, this fills in the gaps for
Yep.
them.
That makes
And
sense.
frankly, I feel strongly, especially nonfiction, it makes you a better narrator. You get to really explore technique. You have the vocal stamina to really to stay in the project, and it's the difference between doing a couple lines on a movie and doing a Shakespeare play. You just become a better performer because of the stamina and focus involved.
I recently did an e-learning project that, for all intents and purposes, it was an audiobook. It was like a field manual. And
Oh,
so I had to map it out, right? It was an hour. I mapped out 2 hours every day for 3 weeks and was in the booth anywhere for, an hour to two, worked away at it a chapter at a time.
right.
Every every other word was an acronym, which was, that's a whole other thing. But you
we
really do
we could talk
learn.
about that. Yeah,
Yeah, you really do learn about stamina and how to it's a totally different world. And again, it gives me a whole other level of respect. But I think I think for any of us, there's also, like, I've talked to people who just love audiobooks. Just like there are people who love animation, or I love doing e-learning. I know it sounds like
hmm
a random genre to some people, but I just really enjoy it. I really enjoy
no,
learning. And so I think
right.
there's an element of that too. When you have that passion and you're doing something that you're excited to get up in the booth and do every day, whatever the genre is, then maybe the money's a little bit secondary to it as well, just because you're having fun and running your business and doing your thing every day, whatever it is that you want to do.
Yeah, and there's also the added thing too. Uh, in the United States, I'm a member of SAG-AFTRA. So once you generate, I think it's 27 or $28,000 under union contracts, whether it's commercial or audiobooks, whatever, you qualify for pension and health benefits, and that's a
Yep.
big deal in my country.
Yeah. Huge deal.
Because once you do that, when I've run the numbers, and I talk about this too with my students. When you look at the premiums you have to pay insurance wise, and the insurance we get through the union is really good. You basically, once you hit that number, you've given yourself about a $20,000 bonus
Yeah.
of money you didn't have to pay for health insurance.
Yep.
And that's a big deal. So, however you get there, once again, that's one more incentive for, at least in the United States, that I think people who do VO, you know, but there's also the flip side of that, because a lot of people I know who do VO, they're not in the union because they get more work doing non-union gigs.
Yep.
And once you join, you can't do that. Although, interestingly enough,
There's always a
um,
caveat somewhere.
yeah, there's always a caveat. So when you join SAG-AFTRA, let's stay within the VO world. We have a thing called Global Rule One, which means no contract, no work. Right? You work under a union contract. You negotiate that. Um, but there is one area where that doesn't apply: audiobooks. You can work union or non-union, and the
Okay.
reason why that is that's allowed us to um, uh, turn a lot of these well, almost all of them now, turn an audio, like a little audiobook company, or even the big ones. We would go to work for them as union members and get enough of us on board, and then we'd basically flip them into being a signatory,
Okay.
or flip them into agreeing to pay us through a paymaster as a signatory, and so we get those benefits. So
Right.
they've loosened the rules a bit for us, and
Okay.
it's made all the difference in helping really good performers get into the industry. Now,
Okay.
for someone, say my Canadian students or whatever, it's a different story because you guys have national health care. But if you work for an American company, you get American rates. A lot of my students in the UK, they would much prefer, and they like to work for the American publishers, because the UK publishers can't offer even
Yep.
they're half of what I've just mentioned, the 260 per finished hour.
That stands true in Canada as well. Let's talk about the idea of paying your dues. I think a lot of voice actors, they walk into this path and it's like, okay, I start with royalty share on ACX, although often there's no royalties to share. Maybe
Right.
they try to work their way up to better books or bigger publishers, more notable authors. Is there a path? Is that the path? Or is this whole idea that you got to pay your dues, is that just a false narrative that people have bought into?
No, you always pay your dues. There's always those outliers. You hear about some film actor in LA, lucks into a book with Random House, and then they
Right.
start working all the time. Now that's the outlier. You know, Here's the thing, that what a lot of it surprises me that sometimes performers, they don't learn the lesson. So, I started out in the theater, and I was working with an off-Broadway class. I did classical theater, so I was doing off-Broadway classics at the Pearl, and I worked around the country at regional theaters. Well, that's great. When I first started doing movies, I was a background artist. And then I worked my way up to under fives, and then over fives. And then, when you get into a new venue as a performer, you start at the bottom. You may get a
Yep.
little leg up because of your general, your talents and your technique, but you still have to start, because it doesn't matter if you've done 15 TV shows. This is just a different kind of performance.
Yep.
And I have to remind that to some of my students who come from theater or film backgrounds. And I tell them, though, that since they are performers and they've got that work history, they'll get in the groove much quicker. But I always tell people, if you're going to get into audiobooks, you should take the notion of making any real money off the table for at least a year. Because what you need when you start is you need the experience and the credits more than you need the money.
Talk about the
So,
credits. Is there a benchmark? Like, if you want to get to a next, if you want to level up with a publisher, you want to get to a
uh,
more notable publisher, you've got to have X number of books, or
it
does it
helped. No,
register?
there is no. Everybody's different. In fact, we were just
Okay.
talking about this at the New England retreat. One publisher said they don't care if you put it up there, but you have to understand, if you have no experience in the thing, your performance will not be as good
Yep.
as someone who's done 20 or 50 or 100
Sure.
books, right? So
Yep.
there's that
Stands to reason.
obvious, yardstick to get over. Okay, so for instance, I have a student. He's a film actor. He does TV, and he's done maybe 10 books through ACX, and now suddenly, bang, he got picked up by, I want to say, Tantor.
Okay.
And he went ahead and auditioned for something that they posted, and he got it, and now they're keeping him busy. So you can still jump to the front of the line, as it were. But yeah, there is a learning curve, because from the publisher's perspective, they're not as likely to invest their money on an unknown quantity.
Yep.
And even though you've done tons of e-learning in corporate, if you've never done, and they're going to hand you a 12-hour book on astrophysics or contemporary culture,
You made me
they
blank
want
out
to
of
know they're
knives.
going to get right. You're going to want to get a good performance.
Absolutely.
So work history does matter in the end, but ultimately it's about storytelling. Are you a good storyteller? And the audiobooks, if you think of in the nonfiction world, which is what I mainly narrate, if you think of that book as a one person monologue, like a one man show, okay, think of it like that you're in front of an audience doing this performance, like
Yeah.
Hamlet or something, right?
Yep.
But it's a 10-hour Hamlet and you're the only guy on stage. Um, that's a good way to think about it. And when you do fiction, of course, then you're playing with all the voices and telling the story. And that's a lot of fun if you're into character voices and so on. Like I'm getting ready in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be doing an Agatha Christie mystery, an Hercule Poirot piece. And so I've been, working on my cheesy French accent and getting my British stuff all polished up.
Yep.
And it's going to be a lot of fun. But yeah, no, there isn't, like I said, the benchmark to me, well, usually I tell my students, get 10 books under your belt before you really start thinking about branching out. You need those because every book you do, you're going to grow in your technique, in your confidence, in your abilities by orders of magnitude every single time,
Yeah.
and you need that. So,
That's where, I mean, that's also where, you mentioned 2-to-1 ratio for recording to finished hour. That's where you get the 4-to-1 down to the 3-to-1, down to the 2-to-1. And same thing with editing, right?
yeah.
It's getting in your reps and getting more efficient as you go.
So, I'll tell you a little anecdote. So, my first book, Cabbages and Kings. So, um, at the time, I didn't have a home studio. And that's another thing that happened for me. I came into the industry when the home studio concept was just starting.
Yep.
I got lucky because before that, unless you were in New York, LA, or major city, they didn't want to touch you
Yep.
because they wanted you in house. But because the volume of books kept growing, they couldn't keep up. And that's where home studios and the technology got cheaper and better for it. And so it's my first book, and I'm going to a, a buddy's house, a friend I'd made professionally, and I had a monitor outside the booth who was going to basically proof me as I recorded so we could make edits right then. And this is back in the days of ADAT, and you had this little remote control shuttle, if you
Yep.
going back 1,000 years. So
Yep.
I
I
was having
remember.
to, all right, so I'm having to perform it and manipulate the thing all at once. And it's my first book. So I've read the book, I've made my notes, but I'm in the box, and Bernadette is sitting outside with the headphones on. And uh, my friend was Grover Gardner, who works for Blackstone Audio. He's done close to 2,000 books.
Wow.
He's a real war, but he's been doing it for 30 some odd years now. But anyway, so I'm behind the mic, I'm ready to go, and you would book a 3-hour session in one of his booths. And in my very first session, after 3 hours of work, I narrated about 15 minutes of material.
Yep.
And so I finish, and it was one of the most exhausting, tense-filled moments. It's like I couldn't speak. I couldn't get past two sentences. So I thank Bernadette. Thank you very much. I get in my car, and I lived in Virginia at the time, so I drove out of DC, got back to Alexandria, and I walk into the apartment I was living in with my girlfriend at the time. I walk in and just collapse on the rug in the middle of the living room. I'm laying there staring up at the ceiling, and she walked over. She said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "This is so much harder than I ever thought it was going to be."
Yep.
But I had nothing else in front of me as a performer, so I went back the next day and I did 20 minutes, and
Yep.
then it's like it was a process of learning to relax and focus and do all the stuff. It was like learning how to play the piano in a way and sing at the same time. You know, it was hard, and
I,
and it takes time to get that to shrink that ratio.
Kids these days, man. Kids these days don't know how lucky they got it with their Adobe Audition. I mean, come on, man. I started in radio with reel to reel and carts, and
You got it.
if you didn't nail the commercial on the first take recording live, you had to go back and do it over again. And there was no edits. And yeah, it totally was that would have been a totally different experience even from now. But I do think, I mean, that's any script, right? I've been there with e-learning. There's been
Mm-hmm.
there's been e-learning scripts. Even now, there's e-learning scripts where sometimes I just want to curl up in the fetal position in the corner of my booth and be like, I can't do this. It's the acronyms, man. It's the acronyms.
Yes, acronyms. And also, it's funny when I do a lot of e-learning too. When you're doing government e-learning, the syntax is odd. So you think, well, that needs a verb, or
Yep.
that needs a conjunction. No, that's the way they say that turn or phrase, which
Yep.
is why, when I do e-learning, which does pay a lot more, the first thing I do is I clear everything out, and I go word for word through that script,
Yep.
and I get on the phone with the producer to make sure that's correct. And I got a real taste of that back. So in the 90s and through the 2000s, I did in DC, I did hundreds of on-camera industrial training films as the host. So I'm in the suit in front of the green screen, and I did those for governments and corporations, and I did convention work, but basically learning to read
Hmm.
a teleprompter. And so, you'd get the script the night before and you'd have to go through it, because if there was a mistake, and there was always a mistake, and you had to correct that on the prompter so you could have the smoothest read,
Yep.
possible. But e-learning, yeah, e-learning acronyms will kill you, and the syntax they use can be
Yep.
really weird sometimes.
I want to go back to something that you said a couple of minutes ago, because I think this is a really important distinction. You were talking about nonfiction, and I loved the idea of the one person monologue, and that made me think, because for me personally as a reader, if I'm going to grab a book to read, it's generally, more often than not, it's a biography.
Hmm.
And I'm reading Schwarzenegger's Be Useful right
Oh
now.
yeah, okay.
And so I watched the documentary series on Netflix a few weeks ago, and then I heard Schwarzenegger on the Tim Ferriss podcast, and so then I had to buy the book. And as I'm reading the book, I literally feel like I'm sitting across the room, and I'm reading it. I'm not listening to the audio, but it does feel like I'm just sitting there with him, listening to him tell the story,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
why the way that you describe that of a one-person show, I was like, that's so genius. That makes sense to me. Talk a little bit about the difference, or is there subtle differences between nonfiction and fiction, and how you approach that as a storyteller? Because I know you're big on nonfiction, still approaching nonfiction as a storyteller.
Yeah, so one of the big misconceptions people have about narrating nonfiction is they equate nonfiction with non-acting.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm just reading the words. No, you're not. No, you're not. That's what AI does, and we can talk
Yep.
about AI in a little bit. Um,
Yeah, we're gonna
you know,
have to
the,
go down that rabbit hole.
yeah, we have to. Yeah, I know. The thing to remember is that uh, so we start with the premise of that there is acting involved.
Mm-hmm.
So there's okay. So I, there's basically four big obstacles that stand in your way. If you were to come to me as my student or trying to get into it, there's really four obstacles. The first one is you have to realize that every decision you make about the book when you're prepping it, every decision has to be with an eye of making it entertaining.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, every decision, because that is the only yardstick you measure an audiobook by.
Right.
Was the
Yep.
listening experience entertaining? That's it.
Okay.
So big or small, like, do I want to use this voice, the tempo here, an acting choice there? It all gets back to that, and that's the core of the act. And the second one is, yes, there is acting involved, but if you don't realize that, you're just going to grind your way through the text, which is no different than AI,
Yep.
which is terrible, right? That's not
Yep.
entertaining. The third obstacle is realizing that the challenge becomes you have fewer storytelling tools than you do in fiction. Because in fiction, we have zombies and love scenes, and we got funny voices and interesting genres to play with. In nonfiction, really all you have is the author's voice, as it were, in quotation marks, their voice giving you their intellectual premise, idea, or argument in a logical progression through the book. So by the time it's finished, they have revealed their truth to you. So when you
Right.
finish his book, Arnold Schwarzenegger will have revealed his truth to
Mm-hmm.
you, the thing he wants to share, right?
Yep. Yep.
Um, but what we don't get to play with are things like I said, voices and gunfights and zombies. So it's like you've gone from having 50 storytelling tools to use in fiction down to say 5 in nonfiction.
Right.
So you
Okay.
have to learn to use those fewer tools as a performer with a lot greater skill. And then the last obstacle is stamina, which we've already touched on. It just takes a lot more mental, vocal, and physical focus to maintain the pitch of the performance you want. Because, I mean, it's like if you were to go see a play on the matinee and the actors are flat because they're all tired. Well, it's not entertaining.
Yep.
And every book requires a different kind of intensity. So, like the comedy book I just mentioned was really fast and poppy. It was very funny. The guy wrote in short, punchy sentences, really sharp guy, and it had a sort of a real energetic feel to it. Well, then I did this other book that was uh, business. It was a business book by this man who runs an MBA program out of Stanford, and it felt very legato, very long and sort of slow and full and very intricate, but the feeling was different. Well, you've got to match that every day while you work on it. So, so there's that. So there is acting involved. But then to stay into what the thing that I teach, I talk it all, I use it all the time, is that broadly speaking, performing nonfiction books is like giving a TED talk. And it's
Ooh,
based on
that's
a real
great.
simple premise that I learned as a kid in the theater. In the theater, before you start acting, you ask yourself three questions. Who are you? Where are you? And who are you talking to?
Hmm.
So you answer those questions and you make believe in it. You make yourself believe in it. Now you're ready
Yep.
to act. Well, so let's do the comedy book. I'm going to use it as the example because I think it's a great book. I think everybody should get it. It's a great piece for performers. Um, who am I? Well, I'm obviously the character of the author, but I'm not trying to be Mr. Kaplan specifically. What I always do is I turn the author into an archetype. So I'm the comedy teacher, or I'm the astrophysicist, or I'm the English professor, you see. I'm the archetype of the character of the author. I'm not trying to mimic the way the author speaks. Because I mean, what happens if he's got a really thick Canadian Canuck accent and he has a stutter? I'm
Right.
not going to do that in a recording, right?
Yep.
So, so you are always the character of the author. Now, then you build a backstory for yourself to say where are you and who you're talking to. So this is where the TED Talk idea comes in. I always narrate. This is different from regular VO. When I do commercial or corporate or e-learning, it's a one-on-one experience. I'm talking to that learner, to that, right? But I realized I couldn't do that in my audiobooks because it pulled the energy down too much. You can do that for a 5 minute e learning program. You can't do that for a 15-hour book.
Yeah.
So I always narrate to an audience of people, right, in a certain size room. Now, the number of people and the size of the room will vary to whatever feels right. So it might be 5 people around a conference table, 50 people in a room, 5,000 people in a huge amphitheater. So in the comedy book, it was like 100 people in a workshop in New York in a theater that I'd worked in. So it's a place I've always been to, so I can feel it. I know
Hmm.
it. And then the audience, who are you talking to, is always a supportive audience. It's the target audience for the book. So in my mind, I am Mr. Kaplan, or the comedy teacher at this specific theater on St. Mark's Avenue. And in the audience are 100 writers, directors, and actors who are really interested in learning how to write and perform comedy. So I build that little triangle and I live inside of it in my head. And so suddenly I'm literally, right now in my mind's eye, I'm standing on that stage and I can see the audience. And what that does is when you have an audience, you're always pushing the energy out on the read. You know, um, in its own, in a way, it's sort of it's analogous, although it's not as aggressive. It's like when you do a car ad, when you do a yell and sell, as they call
Yep.
it.
Yep.
You're grabbing the whole audience. You're not talking to one person, you're telling everybody. It's in the same family. So anytime you listen to anything I narrate, just know that I've built that triangle, which is like a TED talk if you think about it, and I am in some kind of specific place talking to a specific audience. And what that does is it turns the text into a script. My monologue is there. And once
Right.
you go down that line, then you're going, well, how does the author feel? Because now it's a character. And if you look carefully enough in the text, the author will tell you, paragraph by paragraph, how they feel about what they're discussing. And that's where you get the
Yep.
acting cues, you see.
Yep.
And I'm angry about this, or let me tell you this wonderful, funny anecdote, or
Yep.
this is a really challenging. Okay, well, there's my acting thing right there. It's
Yep.
really simple, but it makes all the difference in the world for the listener.
I had Everett Oliver on the podcast recently, and we were talking about specifically he was diving more into commercial, some into gaming, but but talking about how he can tell when he hears an audition whether or not it's been prepped. Did you just print this off, walk into the booth and start reading, or did you sit this down, actually read through the directions and the brief that was provided, and
Right.
are you putting that into the audition? And how that can make that often is what makes the difference between the voice actor that books, the voice actor that doesn't book.
Right.
So is it fair to say that it sounds like that's what's going on in audiobooks as well, is
It
probably the
should.
ones that are doing really well are the ones that are going through that process you just described, versus the one who's just grabbing the book, opening it up, maybe looking it over, but walking into the booth and just trying to phone it in almost.
Yeah, I mean, well, here's the irony. There are some people who are just damn good storytellers, and they also have
Yeah.
great voices, and they can pick it up and just go. I mean, I've been doing this long enough. If you give me a book and give me a few seconds, I can figure it out and give it a pretty good read. Not as good as it would have had I prepped it, but it would still be a good read. But
But
that's
that's
just
earned.
work
That's
history.
also,
Yeah, that's it, right.
yeah, like that's earned, right? You're not
So
just first day walking in and doing it. That's
no,
20 years of doing it
but
every day.
from most narrators, when they get into nonfiction, since they don't understand these things that I just discussed about the obstacles that get in your way, that you got to
Yep.
act and having a distinct point of view. Yeah, they're just reading the text and they're making sense of it. I'll tell you another little thing that's also slightly different from corporate and e-learning. So when we're doing corporate and e-learning, you're basically narrating sentence to sentence. The sentences have been structured to give you little bits of information, right?
Yep.
But in nonfiction, when you read, when you look at Arnold Schwarzenegger's book, you're going to discover that, once you have a noun and a verb, you've got a sentence, so you got to put a period on it. That's the rules of grammar. But that's not actually the way we think, nor
Yeah.
is it the way we actually speak.
Yep.
Because, like right now, I've been discussing this concept to you. If I wrote it down, there'd be like, I've already gone through 4 or 5 sentences. But have you heard me stop? No. Why? Because I'm pursuing the little idea that's inside the paragraph.
Right.
And once again, that's like, it's like if you were a musician learning to read the music ahead of yourself. And as in our world in VO, you read slightly ahead. What you're looking for is the idea that the author's working through continuing on into the next sentence? If so, I'm going to continue on until I reach the end of that little idea. Boom, put a period on it.
Yep.
And then maybe pick it up and then finish off the paragraph. That's a technique issue, but that's how it sounds conversational.
Okay.
Right? So you
Yep.
have to fight that. And that's one of the things that I learned, because I didn't do corporate or e-learning until after I got into audiobooks. And I had to unlearn that for corporate, because their stuff is, their little nuggets, little slugs on this, you've got
Yep.
that little slug, it's to time, and that thing beat, that thing beat, that thing, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a different way of approaching the text.
So we got to go there now because you brought it up. You brought it up. Actually, this is one of the things that I've been enjoying, because I've had, I mentioned I had Everett on. We talked about commercial. I had Christina Malizzi on. We've talked about gaming and animation. I've had Liz Dinesh on. We've talked about telephony. So I've been bringing in some different people to talk about different genres. And one question I'm asking everybody is their take on AI. And,
Right.
and I think the narrative in the industry as a whole is primarily negative, right? We're all doomed and this is the end. And that seems to be what a lot of voice actors think. But from the experts that I'm speaking to in different genres, that's not what they're thinking. That's not how they're feeling. And I think one of the common themes, and you've made it abundantly clear here too, acting, right? AI can't act yet. So talk about AI in the audiobook space, and what are your thoughts on where you see it now and where you see it going?
So it's already here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think instead of thinking of it as, I think the key here is we use the term AI, artificial intelligence, but I think that's actually a misnomer when it comes to what we're doing, because AI is a predictive algorithm, right? So when you go to Chat GPT, you can give it parameters and it'll create this new thing. Well, what it's done is it's derivative. It's pulled
Yep.
from its database to make this
Yep.
thing. Okay, so it doesn't create anything new. And AI is going to be here. It's going to take some telephony away, some e-learning, some corporate, if they're more concerned with money and not
Yep.
what really counts, which is retention. They've done studies. I'm sure maybe other people have mentioned this. They've done studies on, say, college students, And when they're listening to just the AI, they still need to look with the audiobook, or the book rather, because after a while they almost tune out the AI.
Yep.
And I think it's because, well, at its core, AI does not have an opinion about what it's telling you, but
Hmm.
the author had an opinion, right?
Hmm. Yep.
And so what makes us different than AI is that when you do text analysis, whether it's for an e-learning gig, corporate, or an audiobook, the author will tell you how they feel. Is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Right? Um, I did a little interview with a guy a while back who there's a new AI program that you have a slider that can set the intensity of the read, which was really strange. He took a piece that I sent him and had AI read it, and he fudged with the thing, so it got more and more intense.
Right.
But I
Yep.
said that's all well and good, but that's just more emphatic.
And it still doesn't sound natural.
It's still, well, it's that what they call the uncanny valley, where it sort
Yeah.
of sounds right, but it doesn't.
Yep.
But the thing is that, okay, so this like paragraph by paragraph, an author will tell you how they feel. And so you have to have the savvy to analyze the text to go, oh, they're sad here. Well, what does it sound like to be sad?
Right.
What is the melody, rhythm, and tempo of sad, as
Right.
opposed to anxious, as opposed to joyous, as opposed to angry? Those alter the way we speak, right? And like right now, I'm being overly sincere and emphatic. And if you want to back it off, maybe I'm very sad now and I'm depressed
Right.
because this was a sad thing. And now I'm speaking slower and quiet. It's those kinds of cues that the listener needs to know what they should be thinking as well. So that's
Yep.
one of the first flaws. Another thing that I point out all the time to my students, and when this question comes up, AI does not have a sense of humor
Nope.
or irony
Nope.
or sarcasm. In fact, if you're a Star Trek fan, the whole plot line of Mr. Data from Next Generation was he was trying to be more human, and there was always a struggle for him to understand humor,
Hmm.
because humor comes in a million different flavors.
Yep.
I mean, there's by nation, there's Canadian humor and American humor.
Yep.
There's men, women, kids, generational humor, situational humor, and humor comes in all these different shades, and that's just general jokey things. Well, then we get into irony.
Yep.
How do you play a line ironically or sarcastically? And there's also different flavors of those things. AI has no clue. And by the time and then if you say, well, they can get an engineer to do that. Really? That means the engineer has to have the ear and understanding about is this line ironic to begin with?
Yep.
So they have to have the same skill set I have. And then they have to have the skill set of manipulating the vocal wave to
Yep.
reflect that, which is, I think that's
If you're gonna go through
crazy
all of that,
complicated.
just use a freaking
Just
human.
hire me. Yes,
Yes. Just
exactly.
use a
So,
freaking human.
yeah, there's nonfiction. I hear this a lot and I read this on message boards, and it just gets my hackles up. Someone will say, "Well, I narrate, fiction and murder mystery, but AI will just take away all the nonfiction stuff because that's not really acting." And I want to, grab that person and throttle them. But the the thing to realize is that if you go from the premise that there is acting, no, you need a real person. Now, there's going to be people who listen to nonfiction who just want the information.
Hmm.
Those are the people who listen to audiobooks at 4 o'clock in the morning when they're on the Stairmaster,
Yeah.
on 2 or 3 times the speed. They're just ingesting information. Okay, there is an audience there, but it's very small.
Yep.
The other thing about the AI, at least in my world in audiobooks, I feel it's a solution in search of a problem. I've been joking for a while that at Amazon there was a meeting a while back where they were all around the conference table, and the guy or gal running the meeting said, "Okay, guys, Jeff needs a new yacht, so we got to figure out a way to make AI work, or whatever." Now we have some safeguards. Our union has an agreement with Audible about AI usage and so on.
Right.
And yes, you're going to have unscrupulous players out there, but in the long form narration, AI sounds really good for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then that first word is slightly off. The emphasis is off, or the sentence doesn't quite land because there's no opinion behind it. And then you're out of it. You're like, whoa, that's a machine.
I'm trying to figure this out because the same people that are making the decisions about whether or not they're going to use these synthetic voices are also the people who are smashing the phone receiver against the wall when they get stuck in an endless loop of AI prompts in an on-hold messaging system. And they're like, this is the worst thing to listen to in the world. Give me a
Right.
human. They've been through that experience, but they're like, we should get these things to do our audiobooks. That would be a really great
Because
idea.
it's cheaper. It's
Yeah.
cheaper and faster. Well, okay. So here's the analogy I've been using. My partner Anna Clements came up with it. And I think it's brilliant. Okay, so you go, I want a steak. That's what I want. I want a steak. And you go to the restaurant and they go, well, you could have this prime rib, this inch and a half thick prime rib with horseradish sauce, beautiful cut, whatever. Or you can have chopped hamburger meat.
Yeah.
But here's the problem. They both cost the same. We're going to charge you the same as the prime rib as you got for that. And that's what ultimately they're trying to do. They're trying to save money on the back end, not realizing that the consumer is going to go, this is hamburger.
Yeah.
I don't like it. I there have been more than enough stories that these are anecdotal, non-scientific, where audio companies are like, we don't want that because we're getting crappy reviews. They're saying this wasn't a good experience. It wasn't entertaining.
Well,
And if
I'm
you
thinking
start
about
from that premise,
if I'm a CEO and I've got my staff sitting through important safety training or something like that, right? I'm coming from the e-learning space. I don't need them tuning out on that, right? Like
yes,
that's a lawsuit waiting to happen. That's a workplace injury or accident waiting to happen. But it feels like it's one of those things where it's going to happen before they're like, oh, maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. And
right.
maybe
Well,
we need to go back
they've
to the
done, like I
humans.
said, they've done some studies about the retention rates.
Yep.
And once again, AI gets into a rhythm of its own narration, and there's that thing where when your brain, the way it's evolved, it you know it it's evolved so that if it senses an ongoing pattern, whether visual or auditory, it goes into autopilot. That's how it conserves energy for because thinking is expensive when it comes to calories, when you
Yep.
think about it. So when you get a good performer, whether in whatever VO it is, the as I say to my students, that your narration must be consistently inconsistent. It's constantly changing, like you and me talking right now. It's a little fast, a little slow. We
Yep.
emphasize this, we stop, we laugh, whatever.
Yep.
All those changes keep the listener's brain engaged. But if the tempo of the read never really varies and there's no emotional connection,
You got
those
Ben
things get,
Stein from Ferris Bueller.
yes, yes, or Hal from 2001,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And it's almost a comic trope of its own.
Yep.
But but if you don't have that emotional connection to the material, and so you're right, for e-learning and corporate, it's not going to have the same punch. And eventually they'll figure it out, you know?
Eventually. Fingers crossed. Well, Sean, I literally feel like I've just sat through a masterclass, and I think what's really interesting is I don't necessarily feel like I sat through a masterclass in audiobooks. I feel like everything that you've talked about is a masterclass, just voiceover across the board. Like you could literally apply this stuff to any genre. At the end of the day, when it comes down to
Yeah.
getting the acting right and doing your preparation properly and putting in the effort and putting in the work. But I know that you do a lot of coaching in the audiobook space. I'm guessing you do other long form genres as well, or
So
tell us
no,
about your coaching.
my coaching. So I'm what they call a strategic coach. So for a lot of if you wanted to work on your golf swing, you'd go to the golf course and hire the pro to work with you, and they would correct you right then. That's tactical. So
Yep.
like if you're doing a workshop on cartoon characters, I said, no, hit that word, do this. Okay, that's tactical coaching.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm strategic. So I have a curriculum. It's like going back to university, basically. I meet my students once a month. Every time we meet, there is a lesson already ready to go. But I teach through nonfiction, and then I teach the business of audiobooks so they can learn how to make a living at it. I wanted both of those things together, and you can't teach that on the fly. You have to have handouts and materials and so on, and that's what I do. Um, I also do one-offs for people. I get a lot of narrators who come to me for a couple of quick lessons because, okay, let's say tomorrow you get hired to do a nonfiction piece, and you've never done one before and you're panicking. And that I get a lot of people like you would come to me for a couple of quick lessons to get you up and running, and we would work tactically, but I would still give you some stuff to work on.
Hmm.
I'm a much more of a teach a man to fish as opposed to giving you the fish.
Right.
Um, Now, and the other thing I do is I also coach authors who narrate their own material. So, for instance, well, I'm not sure if Arnold Schwarzenegger would want to narrate his entire book, but oftentimes you'll have a celebrity in their own field,
Yep.
and they well, I want to narrate my piece, and if they work it out with the audio company, or sometimes they just come to me privately, and I teach them some basic things over several weeks to get them ready for the experience.
Right.
But mainly, what I do is I teach through nonfiction, although I have been told by my students that 80% of what I teach them they use in their fiction work.
Hmm.
And for my students who do e-learning in corporate, they use everything I teach them in the other work.
Well, I mean, that stands to
Um,
reason with what I just said. I feel like I sat through
exactly.
a master class that wasn't, this was
Yeah.
supposed to be about audiobooks, and it was, but it really could be about just about any genre in voiceover.
Yeah. And so and when I go through the different nonfiction genres, we touch on e-learning in corporate through this context of audiobooks, meaning like, how do you do an interactive self-help piece where you tell them to, we're going to do this exercise now? Well, that's e-learning. Or you might do a how-to book where they have to write down instructions for something. That's e-learning too, in a way, or
Mhm.
corporate. We deal with how to break down the script analysis, and of course the performance of it. There are certain rules, as it were, to narrate a nonfiction piece, just like there are certain expected rules for corporate and e-learning, and we discuss that too. Then I help them with their demos and their promotional stuff so they learn how to go out and hunt down the work. And, we're in website construction and branding is a big thing I'm into. So yeah, it's a two-pronged program. I teach through nonfiction, but I also teach them the business of audiobooks at the same time.
So, if somebody is interested in working with you, where do we go to find out a little bit more information? How do we get in touch?
So you can check out my website, SeanPrattPresents.com. That's
Okay.
SeanPrattPresents.com. It's got all my different stuff in there you can click through. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook at SP Presents or LinkedIn. But my email address, if you want to go right to that, is Sean Pratt, SeanPratt, at Comcast.net. And what I usually do is I send you some promo stuff. We set up a time for a free consultation, and I sort of do a little presentation where I say, this is what I do and how I do it. And I let you ask me any questions you'd like.
Okay.
So I would, because it's a big commitment. I'm with a student for at least a year,
Mhm.
and I want them to understand what they're getting into. It's not a one-off
Right.
workshop kind of situation. It's not free form. There's always going to be a plan every time we meet. But yeah, that's how
Okay.
they can get a hold of me.
All right. And I'll include all of that in the show notes, so it's really easy for
Sure.
anybody to find if you want to find his website, social media, etc. This has been amazing. Sean, has
Oh,
been a
good.
really great conversation. I was nervous at the beginning. We were having some technicals, but we got it all sorted out and
We
we were
got there
able
in
to
the
do
end.
it.
Yes.
And man, this was absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much for the time that you've given us and for the information that you've shared. And this is one that I'm going to enjoy going back and listening to on the edit so that I can make some notes on a few of the things that you said, because I can already think of how some of this is even going to apply to the e-learning that I've done. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Very welcome. You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.